Hi climate changers. I'm Dr. Carlisle, one of the instructors of Climate Changed FYE. Before we get started, here is a little information about our CLE on Thursday. Before Thursday, please download the Seek app by iNaturalist on your phone. Meet at 9:55 a.m. at Chapman Auditorium as normal, and please bring a pen or pencil. We will be going outside once the CLE starts, so as much as you can, pack light and dress for the weather. Okay, so one of the central sources of suspense in the novel we're currently reading, Weather by Jenny Offel, is whether Lizzie will do something. Will she take action about the various issues in her life, her brother, her career, her marriage, or will she continue to be passive, allowing herself to be subsumed by the everyday details of life? Most importantly, for our purposes, will she take action about climate change, the existential threat? Every day she learns more and more about it, and yet she does nothing. Why, we wonder, does Lizzie not act? And by extension, the novel asks, why do we not act? We who, every day, learn more and more about climate change and the existential threat it poses to everything and everyone whom we love. There are many answers to that question, but one of them might be that many of us are so profoundly disconnected from the natural environment. Think of Lizzie's experiences of nature in the novel. She tells us that from her bedroom window, you can see the moon if you lean out and crane your neck. Her dog kills a baby rabbit. They trap mice. Sylvia takes her to look at natural landscapes simply because they are disappearing. Lizzie's connection to nature is pretty tenuous at best. In fact, halfway through the book, Lizzie takes what she calls a hippie test. It asks her questions like, when is the next full moon? Trace your water from precipitation to tap. Name 5 grasses in your area. I'm really hoping there's some kind of extra credit, Lizzie says, or else I really bombed it. The hippie test, it turns out, is Where You At? A bioregional quiz developed by Leonard Charles, Jim Dodge, Lynn Milliman, and Victoria Stockley, and published in Coevolution Quarterly 32 in 1981. Dr. Lyons, who teaches in our FYE, was able to find it for us. It's no wonder Lizzie failed it. Many of us would. What soil series are you standing on? Name 5 resident and 5 migratory birds in your area. What are the major plant associations in your region? What seasons do the deer rut in your area? If you don't do well according to the quiz's terms, you have your head up your ass. If you do fairly well, you only have a firm grasp of the obvious. I wonder how the quiz's authors would write it 40 years later. 40 years later of no action on climate change and continued degradation of the environment. It is, after all, quite possible to be connected with nature and not know what a soil series is or a plant association is. Think of a farmer who hasn't taken a geoscience course. Think of a grandmother who understands medicinal plants but maybe hasn't taken a botany class. What if you come from a place without deer? What if you're from the coast? What if you're from the city? What if you live in a small town in the middle of the country, but you work 2 jobs and you're a single mom? Do you have time to go bird watching? Is it just that you have your head up your ass? Or are you disconnected from the land because of the economic and social systems in which you are inextricably bound? And if the quiz's purpose is to teach, its jargon and tone aren't going to do that. They're more likely to make someone give up. Oh, I don't know enough. I'm not an environmentalist or a scientist. I don't belong here. If the purpose is to invite people into a relationship with their land or to advocate for its protection, it certainly isn't very inviting. In the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Judges, the story is told of a great battle between the Gileadites and the Ephraimites. The Ephraimites were defeated and the survivors tried to sneak back to their territory. But the Gileadites set up checkpoints so they could catch and kill the remaining Ephraimites. The Gileadites made everyone who came to their gates say shibboleth, their word for grain, because the Ephraimites did not have a sh sound in their language. So they said Sibboleth instead. The Gileadites knew immediately that if someone said Sibboleth, they didn't belong and should be killed. Thousands of years later, in English we use the word shibboleth to describe a custom or a tradition or a phrase or a term that separates one group from another, that determines insider or outsider status. It's a way of gatekeeping, including some and excluding others. Words like soil series, plant association, head up your ass, the whole idea of a quiz can be used as shibboleths, especially if the person using them is more interested in making themselves feel superior than teaching or building community. And so maybe the test itself is one more reason Lizzie, and by the extension, the rest of us, don't act. She failed the hippie test after all. How much easier then to leave the work up to people who do know, who don't seem to want to help her because she isn't an insider. Instead of educating herself, she just carries on. In our individual sections of climate change, many of us listen to the podcast, Is Your Carbon Footprint BS? Alex, Ayana, and Catherine Wilkinson discuss how important it is to pay attention to how we talk about climate change, environmentalism, and actions.
Talking about it, super important, but also super important, how we talk about it.
Here's Catherine again.
We have to be really careful because nobody wants to come to a finger wagging party, right? And a lot of these like individual...
That sounds terrible and kind of creepy. You're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
You're not a perfect environmentalist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and that's kind of been what the environmental movement has done. Like, you need to do these things and not do these things. And like, if I see a light bulb that's not an LED, like you are off the list, you know, like we need to be welcoming people in, inviting them in. And I don't want people consumed with shame and guilt when we should be thinking about how powerful we can be together. Right.
Right.
And maybe that is the real tragedy of Lizzie and weather. People who are supposedly enlightened about climate change, people who supposedly know better, dwell isolated in their powerlessness simply because they don't work together, simply because they gatekeep instead of invite. The authors of Where You At quiz meant it as a teaching tool, and in the end, it was a really good impulse to want to teach that. Because knowing where you're at, where you live and dwell and take your sustenance, being connected to the land is incredibly important for all sorts of reasons. It's important for our well-being. In a few weeks, Dr. Krim will teach us how regular exposure to nature can improve our health. And as we've just thought about, helping people be personally invested in nature can help them take action on climate change. But there's another reason our disconnect from nature has been so harmful. It's one of the reasons we got into this mess in the first place. That reason is that humans changed the land, and we don't even know that we've changed it. And if we don't know the land to begin with, how are we going to notice how it's changed? At the beginning of the semester, we read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Sky Woman Falling. In it, she mentions how her students can't think of one positive interaction between humans and nature. Kimmerer isn't surprised, really, given that her students come from a culture that's profoundly disconnected from the land, as opposed to her own Potawatomi culture that is traditionally intimately connected with the land. So before we get started thinking about negative change, I thought I'd bring you here to a site of positive change. I'm speaking to you from Phil Hardberger Park, here in San Antonio on the north side. It's one of my favorite places in the city because it's what we call an urban green space, a patch of nature in a city or a rapidly developing suburb. The grassland behind me looks wild, natural. It's savanna, and it's what much of this land would have looked like before European contact. But it's actually relatively new. Hardberger Park was a dairy farm during the 20th century. Cattle grazing, fire suppression, and introduction of non-native species transformed the landscape that its original inhabitants, the Coyotecans, Apache, and Comanche, knew. More trees moved in, grass became sparser, it started to feel like a forest. But then, in 2009, hundreds of volunteers, many as ignorant and inexperienced as Lizzie, planted tens of thousands of native grasses and plants. Today, it's a thriving patch of savanna or prairie land, now a rare ecosystem and home to countless animals and plants. In fact, if you're really quiet, you can hear an owl hooting over there. I like that story because in it, humans made a place for nature, just like Sky Woman did. Let's go for a ride. This used to be a beautiful meadow. Bluebonnets everywhere in the spring, deer grazing. I used to drive by it every day on my way to Trinity. So yeah, I saw that change happen right before my eyes. But what about change we can't see? What about change we can't remember? Which leads me to a second idea. Humans don't necessarily realize or remember how they changed the environment. So right now, in my own scholarly research, I'm writing a book about Durham Cathedral, which is a really big, really old church in the north of England. It was built in 1093 by the Normans, these guys. I spent a year living in England to study it, and I got to explore a lot of cool places that the public never gets to see, like a medieval dungeon, the roof beams and the bell tower, or this place, the Triforium, which millions of people actually have seen before, probably including you. Yeah, that's right. I've been in the third floor corridor of Hogwarts. But what has this got to do with the changing environment? Well, a lot, actually. While I was in England, I fell in love with the English and Scottish countryside. Beautiful, huh? I was constantly in awe by this bucolic, relatively untouched land. But what I learned through reading is that much of England and Scotland was originally covered by a thick forest. And it was through human activities like agriculture, shipbuilding, and cathedral building that the forests were wiped out. This happened centuries ago. And while coal mining was still happening in England in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, a lot of the beautiful land around Durham, my church, looked like this. So those natural landscapes I fell in love with, man-made, in a way totally artificial, and in fact, an artifact of ecological devastation. The poor remnants of a once diverse and rich environment. But because it happened centuries ago, I didn't know that. And even some English people wouldn't necessarily know about forests either. They inherited the land looking like this and assumed it had always been that way, without knowing how much richer it had been in the past. For them, this is what natural looks like. This is what normal looks like. John Mualem, the author of Wild Ones, describes this phenomenon in this way. All of us accept the world we inherit as normal. Over the years, we watch as forests get logged or animals disappear, but when the next generation comes along, they accept that depleted version of nature as their normal. It's hard to zoom out and really feel the changes that have stacked up over the generations. So how do we know that England was once covered by forests, since none of us were alive back then? Well, old books can tell us things. Sometimes literally, because people have been observing and writing about nature since ancient times. And also because people like to press wildflowers and plants in books. And also because we can study the pollen found in books and see what plants it came from. But we also know there was a great ancient forest because we can visit places like Durham Cathedral. I told you it was relevant. The roof beams in the bell tower, the wood beams in the Triforium, this door. That wood is original equipment. The oak that made that door was felled in the 1100s. The logs that hold up the Triforium are from the 12th century too. the ones in the tower from the 1400s. We know there were massive ancient oaks in England because they're still there in buildings. Using a type of tree ring analysis, something called dendrochronology, those pieces of wood can even tell us what the climate was like back then and about the natural changes in climate, which we'll talk about this semester. No, what's happening now isn't normal or natural. So humans change the land, and we don't necessarily realize it because compared to the land, you and I are babies. We just got here. Humans can't remember the change that happened before they got to a place either. And it's not just England. Hey, Dr. Ribble. Hey, Dr. Krim. How are you?
Good to see you.
Doing great. Thanks. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us today. So you guys probably all remember, but Dr. Krim and Dr. Ribble teach in our climate changed FYE. But what you might not know is you guys are alums, right? You're Trinity alums.
We are tigers at heart.
So what years did y'all graduate?
Well, I graduated in 1982.
And I like that. Wow. And I graduated still before you guys were born, but 1993 and then MAT 1994.
Okay, cool. So the reason I wanted to talk to you is I've been hearing these rumors that the fountain, like the one outside Northrop, that we are supposed to get dunked in on our birthday, I've heard rumors that it's not where it used to be. Like it actually moved over the course of the years at Trinity. And is that true? Like, where was the fountain when you were here?
Yeah, I don't know how they moved that fountain. But when I was here, it was on the other side of Northrop. In fact, the Northrop Hall that you guys go to now didn't exist either. It was a long, dark building where you used to have to sit in the hallway and do registration on paper and that kind of thing. But the fountain was, so if you're walking outside the sliding doors and coats, you would walk straight into the fountain on the very front of campus.
What I remember too about it is there was a flagpole right by it as well. And so back in my day, okay, you got thrown into the fountain, but not only did you get thrown in the fountain, it was also traditional that your clothes would be taken off of you and they would raise it up the flagpole. And so, after you were dumped into the fountain, you had to run over to the flagpole and pull your clothes down the flagpole and put them back on. That's a true story.
Wow.
And it also, you didn't walk down into it. It had a red brick ledge around it, didn't it, Dr. Ribble? Because I remember getting like bruises on my shins because like you had to go up over a ledge to end up in the fountain instead of like walking down into it and tossing people in. So they've made it dunk friendly.
Unfriendly and also really, really rated G. I'm so disappointed that was moved. Okay, cool.
We didn't have cameras on our phones back then, so
That's right.
I wouldn't have thought of that in a million years, right? When I come on campus, it looks like that fountain has been there like for forever, and that is crazy that it's moved. And
You used to, I didn't know Dr. Krim, but you used to be able to drive actually through campus. You could drive right by Northrop, and there was a road that.
yeah, you could go all the way through around Lori and by the auditorium in front of the library, and yeah, you could take your car all the way through campus, definitely.
so not just golf carts, like actual cars.
Actual cars, yeah. It was kind of crazy. It's a lot nicer now.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Jeez. So, I mean, we don't need alums from 82 and 92, 94 to tell us this, but like, so before Trinity's campus was here, this was like a quarry, right? Like an actual quarry. And then before that, so like some of the place that we're going to go explore tomorrow, right? Like, I think it used to be like a trash heap, a trash minden, right? That wild area sort of on the north side of campus, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you look at, a lot of the houses around Trinity are built with limestone that was quarried there. And it's also interesting. You can go back and look at pictures, and you're right about the trash quarry, but also there weren't all these oaks around campus. It was much more deserty. I mean, this is before my time. And so, not only has there been a lot of changes in terms of the buildings, but there's also changes in terms of the vegetation. Okay.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for joining us, you guys. It was really fun chatting with you. And I guess I'll see you tomorrow, right? Maybe in person with the mask on?
Yes,
Yes, absolutely.
definitely.
Okay, awesome. So what just happened in that conversation between me and Dr. Ribble and Dr. Krim might be called an example of generational amnesia, the forgetting that happens between generations. And so they remember the fountain being at a certain place, but I, a couple generations of Trinity faculty later, had no idea that the fountain had moved, and I thought its original place and normal place was Northrop Hall. And so humans change the land, and we don't even know it. We're born into a place, or we move there, and we think that we're experiencing it in its original state. And chances are, we're not. Now, let's move this idea of sort of amnesia to our ecosystems and environmental health. The same concept applies. We don't know how the environment changed before we were born or before humans started observing or measuring or paying attention. But it's almost like the human race has amnesia because each generation is starting from a new baseline for what's normal. And just so we're all on the same page, a baseline is a minimum point that you use for comparison. So our expectations change. We accept environmental degradation, absent forests, depleted fisheries, rising temperatures, because we don't know any better. We transform the world, but we don't remember it. We adjust our baseline to the new level, and we don't recall what was there. Now, Dr. Pauly is a marine fisheries scientist. He noticed that when scientists from outside a culture got to an island to study a marine environment, they ignored what native islanders would tell them about the past, about previously thriving fisheries and immense fishing catches. The scientists would take measurements and use what they found as the baseline for environmental health, failing to take into account the declines that had already happened. And so in 1995, Dr. Pauly coined the term shifting baseline syndrome. So through the magic of technology, I have taken you to Florida. Well, not really. It's my Zoom background, but okay. It's cheap tricks. So this is a great catch, right? It's good to know that fish are so plentiful in the wild, even now. Well, I think you already know that I'm being sarcastic and that there's a catch, right? Sorry, bad pun. But this fish stand is an excellent example of the phenomenon that we're talking about. So this is an American scientist named Lauren McClanahan, and we're going to learn a little about her research about this particular fish stock because it's a good illustration of a shifting baseline. First, you're going to read a short article about Dr. McClanahan's research, and then you're going to watch a YouTube video of a TED Talk by Dr. Pauly. I want you to go ahead now and pause this video and click the link to the NPR article, which should be in the description of this YouTube video right here. And then when you're done reading, go back there and click on the link to Dr. Pauly's talk. If you can't find them on the YouTube description, they'll also be posted on TLearn. So I'll see you back here in a few.
Okay, welcome back. So the concept of shifting baseline that you've just learned about can be summarized and defined as a situation where knowledge is lost over time about the state of the natural world because people don't perceive changes that are actually taking place. In this way, people's perceptions of change do not match the actual changes taking place in the environment. So why is this important? So what? Who cares? To answer that, I'd like to use the words of another scientist who studies shifting baselines, Dr. E.J. Milner Gouland. If we don't realize what we are losing, she says, we stand the risk of sleepwalking through the destruction of the natural world without taking action to remedy the situation. I think you can probably see how this concept of shifting baselines might be applicable to climate change. Or to put it another way, how do we not notice that summers are getting hotter and drier? How do we not freak out when the trees are budding out earlier in the winter, or the river no longer freezes, or springs that never used to run dry keep failing? Shifting baselines can also help explain some of the apathy and inaction we observe in response to environmental degradation and climate change. People don't know better. They've forgotten. And because of that, we face an almost insurmountable environmental catastrophe.
Okay, so now we get to the million-dollar question, or really the life or death existential question. What do we do about it? How do we stop that amnesia, that forgetting? One answer is really simple, and yet I think also pretty profound. It comes from the writer Derek Jensen. But here is what I want you to do. I want you to go outside. I want you to listen to the disappearing frogs, to watch the disappearing fireflies. Even if you're in a city, especially if you're in a city, I want you to picture the land as it was before the land was built over. I want you to begin keeping a calendar of who you see and when. The first day each year you see buttercups. The first day frogs start singing. The last day you see robins in the fall. The first day for grasshoppers. In short, I want you to pay attention. If you do this, your baseline will stop declining because you'll have a record of what is being lost. Paying close attention, learning everything we can about our landscape, becoming reattached to nature, is exactly how we stop forgetting. And so we come back to Lizzie and the Where You At quiz. Lizzie had a choice when she failed that quiz. Instead of shutting down or tuning out, she could have educated herself. She could have chosen to learn what she didn't know, to experience what she'd never seen. She could have been a witness and not just a bystander. On Thursday CLE, we're going to educate ourselves about the natural world, focused on Trinity and San Antonio, through what I think will be a very fun activity. We'll establish a baseline for ourselves and make ourselves witnesses and inhabitants of this land, which for many of you is a new place to belong to. We'll know where we're at. So okay, remember to download the Seek app, bring a pen, and I'll see you Thursday.